now I'm going to hand over to Mark Pearce, who's Regional Advisor for Foundations for the East of England and East Midlands, and has been heavily involved with developing a new guide that we're publishing today, which the link will be in the comments. So over to you, Mark, to introduce this afternoon's session.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. And it does give me great pleasure to actually finally be at this point where we can release the resource and design guide. A little bit of the history is we've had a working group who you'll hear from Coral in a bit, from the Challenging Behaviour Foundation, and other organisations have been involved in trying to understand what it is we need in the sector, what the issues are. And obviously, as a regional advisor, we often get asked certain questions. And from a personal point of view, from my background coming from health and social care, I was slightly worried we were beginning to, if you like, create mini cages in people's homes. And a gilded cage is still a cage. So it was trying to explore what resources could be available to make people look at the problem slightly differently, take a much wider approach, I guess, rather than just putting a lock on a door and trying to keep somebody, if you like, contained or restrained. And that's really not what adaptations are for. So the working group, we went through a lot of iterations in talking around what was required. We produced a survey which went out to everybody working in the field to look at what types of products, solutions, interventions were being used. We started then to produce a guide, and I have to say at that point it was rather unwieldy. It was probably 70 pages long, and we then got set of students involved in a project to look at it, and we got some feedback, and we kind of got to the final iteration. And I have to say it's been an absolute pain to get to this point, but an absolute pleasure as well. And the pleasure comes from seeing people where you can have an interaction. They can consider some options around the individual and actually look past it just being an adaptation, but look at the wider picture. And some of what came through in the guide is actually core design principles that may be useful for people to refer to, but most importantly, are very person-centered and individualized. I think the aim of the guide has always been that adaptations will remove barriers and create opportunities for people to thrive. And often we will see that actually the thriving element isn't necessarily there. And of course, we've had Rachel Russell, most of you will probably know, oversees or chairs the Behaviour of Concern practitioner group. And they're also producing a lot of case studies that will feed into this guide as well, which just detail working together, working in a joined up way, and some of the solutions that can come out of some really good design principles and adaptations that aim to get the best out of an individual. And one of the greatest thing and the strengths, I think, of the guide is it focuses on a very personalised approach. So you've got your personalised approach looking at the individual, looking at the strengths-based focus of that individual. So what strengths has that individual got? When we're looking at behaviours, it's often on the negative aspects, and there can often be two sides to that. There can be the strengths that actually, if we keep somebody engaged and independent in their own home, does that minimize some of the behavior? Is that able to give them the next stage, which is supporting their autonomy to be independent in their own home, which, as you will all know, the principle of the DFG is to keep people independent in their own homes for as long as possible, and certainly around behaviours of concern, looking at supporting that autonomy for as long as possible. And one that I know that I think Coral will also mention in her presentation will be respecting the lived experience, listening to people. Families will often be frustrated when they're sort of coming down, looking at an adaptation for a behaviour of concern. But actually, they've got a lot of information and a lot of knowledge, and they need to be engaged and engaged in a really positive way that gets the best for them, for the person who requires the adaptation, and actually just listening as well, because sometimes there will be clues within that there might be other interventions that are working that can be considered. So actually taking that lived experience from the family point of view is really, really important. What we've tried to do within the guide is pull together some useful resources. So there's a lot of structure within the guide. When you have the link, you'll be able to go through it. And it's links to other organizations where you can find out further information. There's links to information on products that are, it's not a recommended product in the sense, but it's this looking at the solutions for certain design adaptations that you might need. And that can be sort of thumb locks. It can be a whole range of different things, from soundproofing to lighting. There's all sorts of areas for consideration. And ultimately, it's about taking a much more multidisciplinary approach to delivering adaptations that are going to be successful. In the role as regional advisor, one of the issues that we often have is an adaptation looked at in isolation. So somebody is, for example, jumping up and down on floorboards. Rather than looking at the bigger issue, they're just fixing the floorboards, and the person will go back. And once the floorboards are fixed, the behavior will continue. And so there's lots of examples where actually sometimes the approach is quite blinkered. It doesn't look at actually how do we manage that or move that forward or make it a much more positive behavior or encourage a behavior in a different way. So much more of a multidisciplinary approach is really important for delivering really good positive outcomes that sort of empower the individual to have a much more independent and autonomous life, and autonomous within their means as well. So as autonomous as they can be. We are looking at a whole range of things within the guide as well, and I'll just run through some of them. I won't go through it in huge detail, but you're looking at creating supportive and predictable home environments. So somewhere that feels safe for somebody. It's predictable, and it can be the exact same thing over and over again in terms of repetition and maintaining that. Supporting sensory needs through adaptations as well. So to try and create much calmer environments, adaptations that might support communication, which can have a wider context in terms of that person's autonomy and independence. Probably one that we are seeing more and more within foundations is the safe spaces for physical distress, where somebody is physically in distress and they are smashing or wanting to smash things. So safe spaces for that. Environmental adaptation for sensory needs. So yet again, you're looking at lighting and the soundproofing. Structured environment for routine difficulties. So sometimes it's about creating an environment that's very structured. You know what the behavior is going to be, and it's creating that environment that tries to minimize as much as possible. Looking at sort of safety and safety in terms of technical safety for movement and exploration. So they lot of movement sensors. You can wear monitors now. You can have all sorts of assistive technology that allows for a certain amount of movement and exploration, rather than putting a lock on a door and keeping a containment. We've got an element on there in sort of climbing safely. Some behaviors of people like to climb or abscond, and so looking at how you might encourage that, and encouraging safe climbing, or adaptations that might encourage safe climbing. We've got environmental adaptations for self-regulation needs, so what that person might need in terms of their own well-being, and yet again, it's about engaging with the family and getting that understanding for the wider picture and some of the considerations that need to be in there. There is a section on food and eating, which obviously comes into its own. There are behaviours around food and eating that might need to be addressed. Yet again, it's not looking at any of these in isolation. It's trying to work together in a very kind of multidisciplinary approach to creating that safe environment where somebody can thrive. And it's not always about trying to get the right solution at the right time. It's considering what might need to be looked at as part of the guide, what can be called upon, what resources are there to support that. And I think it's a really, personally have been really pleased to be involved in the process of getting the guide to this point, and pleased from that personal point of view of actually giving people the information to make much more informed adaptations that meet the needs of the individual, as opposed to creating, as I said, mini environments that might be more containment. It's about giving somebody a quality of life within the DFG framework, within the adaptation that meets their needs, that allows them to thrive. And I think that's probably the biggest message that I can take out of the guide. It is about that individualization, putting the person at the center, but also considering what resources and support are needed to consider what can make a real positive environment. So I really hope that you certainly go and have a look at the guide, get a sense for what the guide is trying to promote. And it really, if the guide does half of what we intend it to do, then it will be very successful, and we'll be very proud of that, because it will make a huge impact on people's lives. And with that, hopefully it's given you enough appetite to go and have a look through the guide and see what we've produced.